This morning we are continuing on in the Gospel of John, and we come to John chapter 9. We just heard the passage read just a moment ago, and the blind man who receives sight, but yet in the midst of it all, you also see a willful blindness. Those who were not willing to accept what was standing right before their eyes. And as in our life, have you ever asked questions not because you wanted answers, but because you wanted to share your opinion? Have you ever done that? Maybe you already knew what you believed, you already had your view, but you still ask questions. Most of the time it happens in arguments, right? And you're trying to trip the other person up. You're trying to convince the other person. You may also see it in a courtroom. The questioning, the interrogating. And in a sense, you see that in this passage. But another thing we have to ask, really, have you ever ignored evidence because accepting it would change your life? Have you ever ignored evidence because accepting it would change your life? Again, we probably do this more often than we think. When it comes to diet, when it comes to finances, when it comes to toxic relationships, but also when it comes to the scriptures. We don't want to accept it because it means something may change in our life. To accept the truth means it's an altered lifestyle, altered something in my life. And really, we see that throughout this passage. When we come to John chapter 9, last week we looked at John chapter 6. Jesus was up by Galilee, the feeding of the 5,000, and we see Jesus going back and forth from Galilee down to Judea to Jerusalem. Most every time going down to Jerusalem, there is a feast. There is a festival going on. And there were three feasts or festivals that required the male Jews to travel to Jerusalem. Now, most likely this is about 2 months after John chapter 6, because the Feast of the Tabernacle is from John chapter 7 all the way here to John chapter 9 and into John chapter 10. Jesus has gone to Jerusalem for the Feast of the Tabernacle, which is during the time of Pentecost. So John chapter 6 was the time of the Passover, which we celebrate Easter around that time, and then Pentecost about 50 days later would have been the Feast of the Tabernacle. So Jesus has gone down to Jerusalem. There's already a stirring. Remember John chapter 5 when Jesus healed the man and told him to take up your cot and walk? And it was the Sabbath day. And from that time, from John chapter 5, the Jews wanted to kill Jesus. They were plotting against him. Not only did he heal on the Sabbath day, but he made a claim about his Father working, and he was working as the Father worked. And in a sense, aren't you thankful that God doesn't take a day off? Imagine God saying, okay, on Sunday I'm not going to answer your prayers. I only work 6 days a week. Now, Jesus is saying God doesn't take a day off. And aren't you thankful for that? I am also working. But again, as we looked a few weeks ago, Jesus wasn't breaking any of God's laws. It was only man's traditions, the house rules that they had created. And as we come to this passage, John chapter 9, here Jesus is in Jerusalem. Now, at the very end of chapter 8, Jesus made one of the boldest statements about claiming to be God. As they were discussing, and he made the statement, before Abraham was, I am. And they knew exactly what Jesus was talking about, going back even with Moses and the burning bush, and God said, I am that I am. The eternal, present God. And so with that, they picked up stones and they were ready to stone him, and Jesus slips away and goes into hiding, but not for long. And that's where we pick up here in this passage. It mentions in John chapter 9, now as Jesus passed by, We don't know how far away he got from the temple, not very far. Because as the pool of Siloam, which is not very far from the temple, Jesus is passing by, he's walking down the street, and as he's going, he sees this blind man. Now, how they knew that the man had been born blind, we don't know. But somehow the disciples knew, well, maybe from past experiences, maybe every time they've gone to Jerusalem, maybe they've seen this blind man. We don't understand how they understood or knew about his whole past life. But all of a sudden the disciples asked a question that stirred up the conversation and what was about to take place. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned? Who sinned? Was it this man or was it his parents? Why was he born blind? In their idea, their understanding, they believed that, well, if something bad happened to you physically, it must have been because of some moral failure in your life. They had the idea that, well, a good person, good things happen to, and, well, if you've had bad things happen, it must be because you're a bad person. Now, in a sense, we reject that philosophy, and yet it still lies within our minds. Why do I say that? How many times have you ever heard somebody say, why did that happen in their life? They're such a good person. Why has this bad thing happened to them? They've done good all of their life. And I've heard so many people make that comment. And so in a sense, it is still ingrained in our minds. But what Jesus does here, he says there is another category. It has nothing to do with this man's sin or anybody else's sin. Now, we do understand that choices have consequences, and there are times that we do have bad things happen to us because of maybe choices that we have made, actions that we have made, or because of the actions or choices other people have made. But when that happens, most every time it is obvious. You see the connection. And if it's not obvious, there probably is no connection. And as Jesus points out here, there is absolutely no connection with anybody's sin and why this man is born blind. He says there in verse 3, neither this man nor his parents sinned, but that the works of God should be revealed in him. There is something bigger. In one sense, the disciples, they are asking, who caused it? And you know, do you have anybody in your household that when something goes wrong or something has happened or something is out of place, the very first question is, who did this? It could be a 5-second cleanup. It takes more time to investigate than it does to actually solve the problem, find a solution. But there is just those individuals that they just want to investigate, they want to find and point the blame to rather than solve the problem. Jesus didn't care necessarily about finding who done it. He wanted to do something looking forward. And while the disciples were asking who caused it, Jesus was looking at what can God do through it. They wanted an explanation, and what we see, Jesus brought about a revelation to them. He says there in verse 4, I must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. The night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, in a sense, it almost seems like Jesus is getting distracted. He gets off, carried away with something else. We're discussing about this blind man, but all of a sudden you're talking about light. And you're talking about working. And what Jesus is saying is, I am only in this world physically for a short period of time. And while I am here, I am to work the works of him who sent me. There is coming a day when night comes. And the truth is, not only would he not physically be working, but there will come a day where night will come for each one of us. where we will not be able to continue working. But he says there in verse 5, as long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. Now, what Jesus is saying is, while I am here in this world, my light will shine the brightest. But what he's also doing here, because when you go back to chapter 7, you see what is taking place. This is the Feast of the Tabernacle. And there were two symbols. Really, the one main emphasis of the Feast of the Tabernacle was the presence of God. And within the Feast of the Tabernacle, there was two symbols that they would use, and that was the water, which they would draw from the pool of Siloam and take to the temple and pour at the altar. The other symbol was they would light many lights within the temple and light it up. And what Jesus is saying, and in just a moment, he uses the pool of Siloam, but he points to himself and he says, I am the true light. Then he continues on. It says in verse 6, when he had said these things, he spat on the ground and made clay from the saliva, and he anointed the eyes of the blind man with clay. Imagine that. Did he have consent? I don't know. I mean, the man couldn't see. And what could be worse than not being able to see with your eyes is getting mud in your eyes, right? And we don't see much of a conversation. I'm assuming he probably talked to the man some, rather than just walking up and just... Why did he do it this way? Spit on the... And John gives clear distinction. With the saliva, he mixes it up. And he puts the mud in the guy's eyes. But then, Jesus tells him to do something. He sends him away. Why? In a sense, as we looked at several weeks ago, about how Jesus, with the man whose son was dying, Jesus sent him away. The man had to walk away from Jesus, an 8-hour journey, believing and trusting on the accounts, the eyewitnesses of what Jesus had done, and the promise that Jesus had given to him right then and there. And he had to walk away. In the same way, Jesus tells this man to go to the pool of Siloam. He had to walk away by faith, not by sight, literally. And he did just that. But also, John gives that translation. Why? Now, John is writing everything down, specific details. There were many details that he did not include. But then the details that he did put in, he was specific. He could have just said, go wash in the pool of Siloam. But John gives a clarification, a translation of that word. It means sent. Why is that? Jesus is using all of these illustrations, all of these symbols to point to himself. All throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus constantly is referring to himself as being sent. Even in verse 4, he mentions about doing the work of the one who has sent him. So he's referring to himself as the one who is sent. And now he sends this man to the pool, which interpreted means sent. And really what Jesus is revealing about him, he is the living water. He is the true water. He is the one who cleanses. And when we come to verse 7, the man did exactly what Jesus had done, told him. So he went away, he washed, and he came back seeing. Well, verse 8, it says, therefore the neighbors and those who had previously seen that he was blind said, is not this he who sat and begged? Some said, this is he. Others said, he is like him. He said, I am he. All of a sudden, the news had spread. This was the talk of the neighborhood. I mean, this person had become almost an icon of the neighborhood, sitting there on the side of the street, begging all of his life. For most of the people around, that is all they remember of him. Just sitting there. And Every time they walked down that street, they would look for him. They would recognize him. And all of a sudden, one day, he's not there. Instead, he's walking down the street. No guide, no stick. He probably excited. The first time he had ever been able to see all the things that he had heard, all the things described to him, he could physically and visually see with his own eyes. And they're wondering, wait a minute, how could this be? It's got to be somebody else. You know, they say that every person has a double, right? You've got to look like somewhere in the world. And they're thinking, man, with everybody coming into Jerusalem at this time of year, it must be just somebody else. Somebody that looks like him, but it's not really him. But the man says, no, it is me. It's me, guys. Trust me. I can see now. So what do they do next in verse 13? They brought him, who formerly was blind, to the Pharisees. Now it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. Once again, Jesus is walking into trouble. But he intentionally did it. He wanted to. Because what we see is these Pharisees, their hearts were so hardened, they were not willing to accept the truth. And what we'll find out in just a moment, the greatest tragedy in this entire story was not that a man lived his entire life up to this point blind and not able to see anything. But the Pharisees chose not to accept or see what had done. It was the Sabbath. And again, Jesus was not breaking a law of God, but in the traditions of the elders, in the house rules. You weren't allowed to mix anything, and what did Jesus do? He spat on the ground, he mixed up the saliva in the mud. That was forbidden under the Sabbath. Not only that, but he anointed the guy's eyes and he healed him. Again, medically, you were not allowed to do anything medical or give medical attention to somebody unless it was critical, unless they were dying and they had to have it. Well, this man, he had been born blind all of his life. Why choose the Sabbath? Why not wait the next day? And verse 16, there is a discussion that is brought up. Really a debate. In verse 16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such things, or such signs? And there was a division among them. Think about what was taking place here. These Pharisees were so caught up on the Sabbath and Jesus breaking one of their traditions that they could not understand, they could not comprehend, they could not even accept what was very evident standing before them. Immediately they say, this man, we're going to cross him off because he does not fit our God box. We are going to cross him off and say he is not of God because he's done this on the Sabbath day. But then others are like, wait a minute. We've never heard of anybody being born blind and being healed. And even this is a prophecy from Isaiah, I believe chapter 35, about the Messiah would come and open the eyes of the blind. And so they're questioning, how could anybody who is a sinner, who is not of God, do something we have never heard of? But these Pharisees are so caught up on their own views, their own opinions, they did not want it to be true. Think about that. They did not want it to be true. The evidence is placed in front of their eyes, and we have to ask, do we want it to be true? Are we open for it to be true? As we continue on in this passage, they said to the blind man, again in verse 17, what do you say about this man? because he had been opened your eyes. He said, he is a prophet. He must be somebody good. He's opened my eyes. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight until they called the parents of him who had received his sight. Now the Pharisees, we don't believe you. Okay, we know that you can see, but we don't believe that you were blind in the past. You just made up this story. You've been able to see all your life, and now you're just trying to say this. And so let's call your parents. Let's find out from your parents whether or not you were born blind. So they call the parents, and they ask them specific questions. What did they want to know in verse 19? They asked, is this your son? Can you verify that the identity of this person is your son? He's not just somebody impersonating your son. Which we find in just a moment, they say, yes, this is our son. Who you say was born blind? Was he blind from birth? And again, they'll verify, yes, he was born blind from birth. The third question they ask, how then does he now see? And that's where in verse 20, they answer these questions. His parents answered them and said, we know, we are absolutely sure this man is our son. And yes, he was born blind. We struggled all of our life through his whole childhood. The trials that we endured, we know it was real. He was not playing us. Now, children do play, but not their entire life, right? But they go on, but by what means he now sees, we do not know. Or who opened his eyes, we do not know. He's of age. Ask him. He will speak for himself. But then John goes on to verse 22 and gives us the reason why the parents try to deflect and back out and say, hey, he's old enough. You talk to him about how he became. We can verify, yes, he's our son. We can verify, yes, he was born blind. How he can see, you go ask him. Why did they say that? His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, his parents said, he is of age. Ask him. Now, his parents tried to stay in neutral ground. They weren't going to reject the miracle. In fact, they were glad for the miracle. They were happy that it changed their son's life. But yet at the same time, they feared that admitting to it, it would change their life as well. And you know, there are many people who are happy because maybe somebody they love, Jesus has changed their life. They could not deny that Jesus has changed somebody's life. But they are not willing to admit it for themselves out of fear. What would happen to my reputation? What would happen to me? I may lose some friends. I may not be able to go and do things that I once did, what I enjoy. And out of fear, they tried to stay in neutral ground. But the reality is, when it comes to Jesus, there is no neutral ground. By not accepting him, we are rejecting him. Even if we see the miracles, even if we recognize, but if we're not really willing to accept, it is rejecting. In this passage, we continue on. In verse 24, so they again called the man. These Pharisees are not letting up. Hey, we don't believe you, we're going to call your parents. The parents verify. So they go back to this man and they said, give God the glory. We know that this man is a sinner. He answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. They keep questioning and questioning and questioning. And the man's response is, you know what? You may have all of the theology. You may understand everything about the scriptures and the Old Testament. And these Pharisees, they would have had books and books and books memorized. Yet this man, he never would have been able to read Scripture for himself. And yet he says, I don't know. I don't have all of the answers. But one thing I do know, I know what he's done in my life. I know I was blind, and I know I can see now. And in this story, what you see is the power of a testimony. If you are a follower of Jesus, can you say that in your life? I know what my life was like before Jesus, and I know what he has done for me. And the reality, you can express and you can talk to others. You don't have to know all of the Scriptures. And one of the things that we find throughout this passage is his knowledge of Jesus continued to progress. The very first statement he made about Jesus was, he's a man called Jesus. The next statement he says is, he's got to be a prophet. And then a little bit later, when he meets Jesus again, as Jesus seeks him out, he says, Lord. There is a progression in this man's life. But in the meantime, he was aware of what Jesus had done for him. And if you have just recently followed Jesus, don't be scared or timid and think, I can't talk about Jesus because I don't know everything in this book. There are so many questions that I can't give a person an answer. But what you can do is say, I know what Jesus has done in my life. I don't know about your answers. We can look those up. And that's what he would continue looking and searching. And yes, we'll figure these things out. But in the meantime, I do know what Jesus has done for me. And the reality is, we don't have to understand everything about God to accept something specific about Jesus. We don't have to understand everything about the Bible to accept something specific about Jesus and who he is. And there may be certain things that may cause you to get hung up on. I don't understand this, so I can't accept Jesus. No, recognize who Jesus is and accept him. This man, he says, whether he's a sinner or not, I don't know. I don't know a whole lot about theology. I've never been into the temple. I've never read the Scriptures, but I do know what has happened in my life. Verse 26, they said to him again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? By this time, man, the man is frustrated. I mean, he goes on, he answered them, I told you already. Have you ever done that before? Somebody just keeps asking and asking and asking. And you're like, I've already told you. What are you wanting to know? What are you wanting more that I haven't told you? And in a sense, you see this frustration, and you did not listen. Why did you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciple? Why do you keep asking me? Do you want to learn so that you can follow? But also, he mentions, do you want to also become his disciple? What he is saying is, I am his disciple. I am his follower. I am willing to follow Jesus. Do you want to join in the ranks? This didn't go over well with the Pharisees. They were not too happy by this outsider who in their minds was considered a sinner because he was born from birth as blind. It goes on, then they reviled him and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to them, why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from. Yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. He says, this is shocking. It is shocking that Jesus has done something so miraculous and you're not willing to accept it. It is shocking that Jesus has given so much evidence and yet you still want to reject it. He says, this is shocking to me. Since it goes on, Verse 32, since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who was born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and are you teaching us? And they cast him out. They tried to silence him. They could not argue his testimony, even with all of their theology. And all they could do is cast him out. But what we find in verse 35 is Jesus goes looking for him. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and when he had found him, he said to him, do you believe in the Son of God? He answered and said, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus said to him, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. Then he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshiped him. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who may see may be made blind. Then some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, are we blind also? Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. As we see the picture unfold and the story unfold, the man was not afraid of being cast out. Why? Because he knew what Jesus had done for him. And in one sense, he may have thought, you know what? The Pharisees, what have you done for me all of my life? Absolutely nothing. You've rejected me. You've tossed me out already. I was not accepted because of my blindness. You could do nothing for me. Even with all of your theology, you've done nothing for me all of my life. But Jesus, who's come into my life, has changed me. He's given me sight. And I'm willing to be cast out to be a follower of Jesus. And I think there's something that we have to ask ourselves. There is a cost to following Jesus. But the reality is what we receive and gain is far more than the cost. This man had been able to see for the first time because of what Jesus had done in his life. But even to the very end, these Pharisees continued to reject every bit of the evidence. This blind man, he was grateful for it to be true because it changed his life. But the Pharisees feared it was true because they knew how it would change their life. But the reality is, whether we accept truth or deny truth, it does not change the truth. It only changes how we respond to the truth. If you receive a diagnosis from the doctor, something you do not want to hear, whether you accept it or deny it, will not change the facts. It will not change the truth. It will only change how you respond to the truth. And if you deny treatment, well, what's going to happen? The truth prevails. If you accept it and you accept treatment, there can be a change. And we have to recognize the same thing when it comes to Jesus. To deny truth does not change the truth. It only changes how we respond to the truth. This man had experienced what Jesus had done for him. And as we've gone through this story, we have to find and ask ourselves, where do I fit in this story? And really, there's, in a sense, three categories. There's the blind man, his parents, and the Pharisees. The blind man, if you're here and you would say, you know what, I know what Jesus has done in my life. There once was a time where I was blind. I could not see spiritually. My life was a mess. And Jesus has changed my life. Use your testimony. Share your testimony. But you may be like the parents. I have seen God work in another person's life. I have seen the difference that Jesus has made to them. But I'm not willing to accept it because of the fear of losing certain relationships. I am not willing to accept it personally because of fear how it will impact and change my life. And then you have the Pharisees flat out denying every bit of the evidence, flat out rejecting because they were not willing to believe. But the reality, the parents, even though they seem like they're in the neutral ground, remember, they were not accepting Jesus. And by not accepting, it is rejecting.